own field, distinct from linguistics proper, as I think Keren hinted at in her opening, a field that differs fundamentally from traditional language scientists in that, to paraphrase Marianne Mithun, it seeks to answer questions which we haven't yet thought to ask. Dell has played a significant role in this, in the emergence and codification of this new field, and I see this as the most important contribution of Dell over the past 15 years. So the stories of Dell are tied together by two interwoven threads: people and data. In their quest to understand the linguistic practices of speech communities, Dell projects are fundamentally about people. Language is a central part of that ecosystem, but crucially, Dell projects attempt to understand language within the context of that ecosystem, as opposed to as an abstract, decontextualized entity. Second, Dell projects are about data and about creating a lasting, accessible, and repurposable record of language use. It is these twin pillars that make possible new discoveries and new knowledge within the field of documentary linguistics. Okay, so let's look at those two things. Documentary linguistics is embedded within language communities and is thus intrinsically tied to community goals and community needs. From the very earliest days of the endangered languages movement, it has been repeatedly pointed out that language revitalization and reclamation must be a part of the documentation project. Whether you see this as a practical necessity or a moral imperative, the result is the same. Documentary linguistics is a science whose laboratory exists not in the cloistered halls of academia, but rather in the tribal halls of Native America and the Fale of Samoa. Documentary linguistics is an activity which can be not an activity which can be engaged in remotely, but rather one which requires collaboration and co-production, face-to-face, in person. Something changed. Sorry, I think these are slides from an earlier version of my talk. But we'll bear with that. So, okay, so moving ahead. The other pillar of documentary linguistics is data. One of the earliest concerns of the endangered languages movement was to ensure the long-term archiving and preservation of language data. To quote a term I first heard from Kristine, the need to preserve and make available endangered languages data led linguists to become, quote, accidental archivists. I've used that label myself on several occasions. The rise of an endangered languages movement in the waning years of the 20th century coincided with an unprecedented digital transformation. Linguists played a leading role in responding to the challenge posed by this looming digital dark ages. We were accidental archivists. The Open Language Archives community, OLAC, was founded 2 years before the Library of Congress published its first guidelines on digital preservation. Who knew linguists would be archivists? The Digital Endangered Languages and Music's Archiving Network was founded shortly thereafter to help promote standards for digital language archives. Dedicated digital language archives were born. But Dell has done so much more than just create archives. In particular, Dell has facilitated the development of an infrastructure for documentary linguistics. This includes funding regimes, publication venues, training programs, development of ethical standards and protocols, and data management. And thanks to Dell, there's now an increasing expectation that claims about language be verifiable, resolvable to actual instances of language use. Dell supportive efforts have led to the LSA resolution on cyber infrastructure in 2010 and the Austin Principles on Data Citation in Linguistics in 2018. Dell has thus helped to facilitate a data-driven, empirical approach to the study of language. So back to my initial question, could we have done this all without Dell? Well, maybe. Some of the individual projects likely would have been funded, although I would argue perhaps not all of them. But I would say a resounding no to the issue of infrastructure. The infrastructure that we have created for this field, the overall ecosystem that we have built for documentary linguistics would not have happened without DEL. Okay, so let me ask a kind of more impertinent question. Okay, great. So we needed DEL to do all this work that we've done over 15 years. Do we still need it? Are we done? Well, sorry, I'm getting... Apologies for reading here. I didn't sleep last night, so I'm trying to refer to my notes here. We've seen here that DEL has been highly successful, and this success has led to an increased awareness of endangered languages across the entire field of linguistics. It's no longer unusual for a theoretician to engage in fieldwork, and few field workers now ignore the plight of language loss within Indigenous communities where they work. DEL-funded efforts have promoted increased awareness of citations of primary data, whether from endangered languages or not. No longer a fringe topic, endangered language documentation and reclamation are now a part of the fabric of the discipline of linguistics. So it is not unreasonable to argue that while DEL may have once been useful, the changes in the field over the last 3 decades have made the need for a distinct funding program less compelling. However, again, I would argue that just the opposite. Documentary linguistics is not merely a subfield of linguistics on par with phonology, syntax, or language acquisition, etc. Rather, documentary linguistics has matured as a discipline of its own with its own methodologies, protocols, and research agendas. There is a need for an approach to the science of language which is grounded in people and data, and which allows us to answer questions which we don't already know enough to ask. In supporting the development of this new field, DEL has simultaneously increased the need for a distinct NSF program dedicated to that field. So let me compare this to other programs that we find within the NSF. For example, consider the programs in anthropology. We wouldn't ask an archaeologist to review proposals in cultural anthropology or biological anthropology. Similarly, we wouldn't ask a cognitive scientists to review proposals in social psychology. Documentary linguistics likewise requires its own pool of ad hoc reviewers, its own specialized panelists, and its own dedicated program officers. For the past 15 years, DEL has served as the primary funding mechanisms for documentary linguistics in the US. The innovations facilitated by DEL are largely unique to this program and not replicated elsewhere within NSF nor in other funding agencies in the US or internationally. So, happy birthday to DEL. In a span of just 15 years, the Documenting Endangered Languages program has been enormously successful in responding to the identified endangered languages crisis. It's done much more than merely respond. It's forged a new discipline. And it's played a unique role, which, again, is not duplicated elsewhere at NSF, nor in other funding agencies anywhere in the world. That said, the endangered languages crisis is not over. If anything, the crisis has accelerated. The reason I haven't slept last night is I just arrived from Micronesia, a place where physical and cultural existence is threatened by the very real effects of climate change and sea level rise. The future of Marshallese, Kapingamarangi, Sathwalese, and many other Pacific languages is inextricably tied to an uncertain environmental future. What will be the linguistic and cultural future of the Kiribati diaspora? And far from being an outlier, the Pacific is rather a harbinger of a future which many indigenous languages will soon face. But while the world's languages may still be in crisis, we are no longer in crisis mode. No doubt there remains much work to be done. We are far from completing the work of documenting the world's languages. There is still a great need for new tools and infrastructure for language documentation, and there is much yet to do to build capacity for undertaking documentation work. But we now have an established infrastructure and methodology in place for tackling that work, much different than we did 15 years ago. This change is reflected in the new program name for DEL, Dynamic Language Infrastructure. By de-emphasizing the words endangered and documentation. We move away from a deficit model of language vitality, and while at the same time making clear that documentary linguistics is about much more than just documentation. The field of documentary linguistics provides us with the tools and methodologies to address the challenges of endangered languages. I'm not arguing for complacency here, but I do think that we ought to give credit where credit is due. In 2022, we will welcome the Decade of Indigenous Languages. DEL, or DLI, will surely play a role in that effort, and I look forward to celebrating the 30th anniversary of the program at LSA in 2035. So thank you. I'd like to express my thanks to Kristine and April for organizing this panel, and to CELP for the contributing to the video. And I'd also like to thank all of you for being here. It's your interest and passion which gives me hope for a bright future for documentary linguistics. Mahalo.
So on the program, it says that I'm a discussant, but what I'd like to do is open it up to questions now. So I think people probably have things to say. Thank you, everybody, for your talks.
I would just like to take this opportunity to encourage you to record 2-year-olds. All that's necessary is to make a 3-hour recording of 2-year-olds interacting in their home environment, and that would be another way in which your efforts can help to document what's going on in the language.
That's a great suggestion, and I would like to encourage all of you to submit proposals for DLI-DEL. For these great projects, we need to boost the proposals, and there's so many fabulous ideas and so many great languages and communities to work with, so we need more and more workers. So take that idea and run with it.
And this goes to everybody, not just students, but faculty, communities. So the one issue with DEL is that it's U.S. funded, and so there's requirements about where you live to get DEL funding. But you can, those of you from elsewhere can go pressure other places. The other funding that there's been, there's ELDP funding, and there's small amounts of funding from the Endangered Language Fund that Kristine could tell you more about.
It's also possible if you're at an institution outside of the U.S. to partner with U.S.-based researchers, and we welcome that. And you saw from my slides, I'm partnering with people in Russia and working with their students as well. So that's another way to collaborate, and I'm huge on collaborations, and that can give you access to
Yeah.
I have a question. I am more of the theoretical linguistics side, and I'm transitioning into endangered languages, so there are a number of questions that come to my mind. For instance, the people that you interact with and collect data with, how do you deal with the IRB? And these kind of issues.
I'll answer in my case. I've worked in a number of different countries, including in places in Africa. So at the University of Chicago, I need to have a local IRB from Chicago, and then most of the places I work with, they don't have their own IRB. So, but my institution requires that I get prior, pre-informed consent in the target languages. So normally I actually do need to partner with people because as I'm learning a language, I need to get it in that language. And then also, even where there aren't government or university local regulations, I find it critical to work within the local culture to do what's culturally appropriate. So that also requires some footwork initially to figure that out. If there aren't local regulations, it's good to look at places that do have them to get an idea of what's important.
And there are places where, like in a lot of northern Canada, you can't do research without having approval from the community council.
So I might have a stupid question, but I think a lot of endangered languages, they are berber languages without written system. So like the language that I'm working on, it doesn't have a written system. So when I did the interview with my speakers, and I asked them what does this word mean, they have their own interpretations, like because there are a lot of homophones in the language, so they are having the different interpretations of the same word. And I feel like this causes a lot of problems when I want to do some semantic change to study that. So I don't know how can you do the transcriptions of the language that you're working on, or how can I figure out this problem?
I'm answering all the questions. So some other people have to. So I would transcribe it all in IPA, and I would actually document all of the responses,
Yeah.
because that's really interesting.
And,
You know?
yeah.
So it's not clear, but it's really interesting, and patterns may evolve. It's gonna take more time to do the analysis.
Yeah, I find that there's huge variation, and we have a tendency to want to level that out. But in fact, that's not good to do, because as Kristine was talking about, there's so much variation in language. And if we level it out, then we can't. Also, I'll talk about it in practical terms. In communities that are interested in revitalization, what are they going to be revitalizing if you're taking out a lot of what's actually going on in the language? So it's a kind of call for the kind of work that people like Laura and Kristine talked about.
People have been asking me, so I'm going to ask you, do we know what the panel is going to look like for DLI in the future? Is there going to be a panel that's going to be put together with people from the DEL community plus people from archiving community? How is that going to change, or is it going to change? And as well, I guess the ad hoc review is going to be, the process will be the same, because we'll look for people who are experts in those fields.
Maybe Joan could respond to that.
On the hot seat.
I'm hoping that actually we're not going to see any changes. It's going to be run in the same way that although in terms of NSF organizational structure, it's been moved under linguistics. The panels will be kept separate. The programs are separate, the budgets are separate, and so they will continue. The panels that evaluate the DLI-DEL proposals will continue to be proposed in the same way that they have been in the past, which is to say they draw from the more academic people, the people with the archiving interests and the computational interests, and people with the community-based interests. So to the extent that possible, both the panelists and the reviewers will be drawn from the same communities that have been.
That's reassuring.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
There was one more hand in the back, and then I think we probably should end because there's a poster session that follows.
I wanted to say that I really appreciate the change in the name of DEL for DLI in order to de-emphasize, one, the idea of endangerment and focus instead on strengths. But I wanted to bring up that one thing that's still not reflected in the current name DLI is that many projects that are funded by DLI are about practices beyond language in a really narrow sense. So for example, work with rap music or work with developmental modality. And I wonder if the mission documents of DLI and grant institutions will incorporate it so that we're not just talking about knowledge and text.
I think that DEL has, if you look at the call that I put up, it so underrepresents what DEL has actually done. And I hope that people will continue to dream those dreams and submit those proposals for work where language is an important piece of it. My own experience is that people, so this is North American experience, is that what people want when they're talking about language is to understand something that's not just language. It's way beyond what we usually mean when we talk about language. And so that's kind of, to me, an essential part of what documentation is all about. And in as much, and I think that word dynamic is a kind of important word there, because it kind of speaks to the interfaces with so many other things. So encourage people to submit those proposals, and the panel will make recommendations about them. So I think to try kind of narrow it, that the contributions are about language in a narrow sense is not the right way to think about it. Okay, well, thank you, Kristine and April in her absence.